When John Wilkes Booth fired the gun that killed President Abraham Lincoln at Ford's Theater, there were many more fingers on that trigger. Now, whose fingers? The Confederate Secret Service, involving foreign bank accounts, multiple would-be assassins, and an orchestrated underground plot that conspired for 9 months to decapitate the Union government before that fateful evening of April 14th, 1865. John Wilkes Booth may have shot the president, jumped onto the stage, and seemed to act alone, but that's really only one small chapter of a much larger story. So good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me, Thayer Memorial Library and the Friends of the Library. And I want to tell you that we're going to start by addressing 4 common beliefs about the Lincoln assassination. That Booth acted alone and was mad. That's a myth. That Dr. Samuel Mudd, who set Booth's broken leg 6 hours after the assassination, was an innocent country doctor. Also a myth. Mary Surratt, a middle-aged innkeeper, had nothing to do with the plot to kill Lincoln. Wrong. And the Confederate government was not involved in the Lincoln assassination. Also absolutely false. The developments that set the Lincoln assassination into motion actually started 6 years before Lincoln's election in 1860. 1860 is when he was elected, when a secret society called the Knights of the Golden Circle was formed, whose members were dedicated to the perpetuation of slavery. Why? Because the drumbeat of abolitionism was growing louder, and Southerners felt threatened by powerful abolitionist political forces, and in response, 3 events unfolded. First, the Southerners formed that secret secessionist paramilitary society called the Knights of the Golden Circle. Their original plan was on the left, to annex what they called a golden circle of territories, including Mexico, Latin America, Cuba, and many of the islands in the Caribbean. But 3 years later, they were more modest in their objective. They wanted, if you can see on the red, on the right-hand side, that was the way the Confederacy was formed. A separate confederation of slave states, with states south of the Mason-Dixon line seceding from the Union, whose goal was to increase the power of the Southern slave-holding upper class so that their power could never be dislodged. Now, why is all this important? Because the Knights of the Golden Circle eventually spawned this group, the Ku Klux Klan. The Knights was no idle organization. James Buchanan was president immediately before President Lincoln. Several members of Buchanan's cabinets were members of this secret society, the Knights of the Golden Circle, whose sympathies lay with the South, including Buchanan's own Secretary of War. There he is in his civilian garb, and then he joined the Confederacy and became a general. And these are people in the cabinet. Howell Cobb, who was the Secretary of the Treasury in civilian garb, and then he became, again, a Confederate general. And even his Secretary of Treasury, even his own vice president, his true loyalties were revealed once the war broke out between the states. He became a brigadier general. Now, the actions of the Knights of the Golden Circle were treasonous. In anticipation of the Civil War, they conspired with Buchanan's Secretary of War to move federal troops from the north to the south toward the end of Buchanan's presidency. Their plan: to leave the North defenseless. Enter into our story John Wilkes Booth, who was so enraged by Lincoln's election in November of 1860 that he joined the Knights of the Golden Circle. Now, Booth was born into a slave-owning family and viewed Lincoln as an ardent abolitionist. And at the time he joined the Knights, he wrote this impassioned pro-Southern speech in which he ranted, "The South cannot live if abolition principles are not entirely swept away. They must burst forth with redoubled horror. We should crush it in its birth." The history books actually have it wrong. There were actually 3 plots that John Wilkes Booth was involved with to either kidnap or kill President Lincoln. We start with the Baltimore plot. Now, in Lincoln's time, it's hard for us to appreciate this, but the inauguration of a new president or a president took place on the first Monday in March. We all know, or should, that presently it's the third Monday in January. But in those days, it was the first Monday in March, which meant there was a longer period between the November election and the time that Lincoln could assume office. And by that passage of time, which was some 4 or 5 months, these states had already seceded from the Union before Lincoln could even take office. He had to watch South Carolina, Mississippi, and all these 9 states secede from the Union and had no power to stop it whatsoever, because he wasn't then president. And a plot to assassinate Lincoln was already brewing. About 3 weeks before his inauguration, Lincoln boarded a private train in Springfield, Illinois, to go to Washington City. We now know it as Washington, D.C., right? In those days, they called it Washington City, or the city of Washington. And Lincoln did a whistle-top tour, that covered 8 states, principally in the North, or almost exclusively in the North, and he gave speeches at 70 northern cities and towns, seen by over 1 million people. And you can see here, started in Springfield, Illinois, which is where his home was, went through Indiana, Ohio, Western Pennsylvania, up to Cleveland, Buffalo, Albany, and then all the way down the eastern seaboard, New York, Trenton, Philadelphia. And then we're going to talk about what happened here, because this was a very important spot. Baltimore, and then Washington City. As his train was making his way across the country, America's first private detective, Allan Pinkerton, was running an undercover operation on behalf of the president of the railroad company that was bringing Lincoln to Washington City. Now, in those days, unlike today, they didn't have Amtrak, so railroads were owned by private individuals. You'd own a railroad, and so forth. Now, the railroad president that passage was on hired Pinkerton, a private detective, because he was concerned that Southern sympathizers would sabotage those tracks, derail the train, and kill or injure Lincoln and his entourage. During Pinkerton's investigation, his detectives uncovered startling evidence of a conspiracy to assassinate Lincoln during his next to last stop in Baltimore, Maryland. The city was seething. It was a hotbed of Southern sympathizers, which included its own mayor, seen here on the left, and its police marshal, which we would now call the police chief or the police commissioner. 4 different credible reports streamed into Private Detective Pinkerton of a carefully devised plan to assassinate Lincoln when he arrived in Baltimore on his way to the inauguration. And what was their plan? The plotters knew that Lincoln was completely vulnerable when he arrived at a particular point in Baltimore. And where is that point? This is where he was going to get off. There were two train lines. One serviced the north and one serviced the south. This is the last stop of the train that serviced the north. This is the beginning train station that serviced the south. So he was going south from here. He was coming in from the north, from, remember, Baltimore and Philadelphia, and this is in Baltimore where he was going to get off. After he got off the train, he was supposed to walk a little bit over a mile through these streets in Baltimore City to the Camden station. It was during that mile trip that the Baltimore conspirators planned to strike. Suspiciously, Baltimore's police chief told Pinkerton that there was no need for a police escort when he left one train station and had to proceed through Baltimore's congested cities. You see, the police chief for Baltimore himself was a member of the Knights of the Golden Circle, and his police department was in on it too. They had no intention of protecting Abraham Lincoln when he arrived in Baltimore. So Pinkerton is presented with a problem. How does he alert the president? He doesn't even know Lincoln. He, meaning Pinkerton, and the railroad president approached a loyal friend of Lincoln to brief him. Pinkerton detailed the plot. They were then taken to meet the president-elect late at night, and Lincoln was exhausted after a day of speech-making and traveling, but he listened to them, and they told him the following: that a group of extremists had organized in Baltimore who would consider it an honor to become martyrs for the Southern cause. Those men had bound themselves with a solemn oath in a secret society. They were determined that Lincoln wouldn't pass through Baltimore alive. Their plan was to use a crowd to surround Lincoln, making him unable to move, during which a few men would take Lincoln's life, even at the expense of their own. And they planned to use hand grenades to do the deed. They did have hand grenades in those days. The plotters hoped that Lincoln's assassination would trigger a war between the states. Pinkerton advised the president to leave Philadelphia, where they briefed him, for Washington City that very night, immediately, to disrupt the assassination conspiracy. Now, when Lincoln heard this news, he was quiet for a few minutes. Then he decided against their advice. He wouldn't go to Washington that night, but rather he would keep his political promise to be in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, which is about a little over an hour from Philadelphia, and then travel from Harrisburg to Philadelphia, then down to Baltimore, and then to Washington City. Lincoln ended up keeping all of his promised appearances in Harrisburg. He left that night. Well, we'll talk about this in a second. This is Independence Hall in Philadelphia, and Lincoln had committed himself to raising the flag in front of Independence Hall. And as you can see, one kid climbed the trees so that he could get a better look at President Lincoln. Later that night, after he was done with his political work in Philadelphia, he left at 11 o'clock and boarded a train in disguise headed to Washington City. He was protected by this man, who was a real hero of the Civil War. His name is Ward Hill Layman. Of all the tens of thousands of people that Abraham Lincoln knew, he trusted Ward Hill Layman more than anyone to protect his life. Ward Hill Layman was so loyal to President Lincoln and was well aware of the many plots that were brewing in Washington City and elsewhere to kill Lincoln. And he'd tell Lincoln about it, and Lincoln's attitude was, well, if they're going to kill me, they're going to kill me. What am I going to do? I got to do my job. But Layman was more concerned than Lincoln was for Lincoln's own life. So much so that in the middle of the Civil War, when there were threats, daily death threats coming at Lincoln, Ward Hill Layman would sleep outside the president's bedroom on the floor with a Bowie knife in one hand and a revolver in the other to protect his president. In any event, with Ward Hill Layman in tow, Lincoln and Layman traveled safely through Baltimore and arrived in Washington before dawn, well before the plotters woke up. Matter of fact, they arrived so early, and that's the hotel that they stayed at. They checked into or tried to check into the Willard Hotel, and the clerk told them that they didn't have any rooms for him. This is the president-elect. He's going to be inaugurated in like a week. And by the way, the sketch on the left-hand side, that is not realistic, but it just shows you Lincoln at a train depot. There was actually nobody there other than one political supporter to greet him down at the train station. When the press learned about Lincoln's arrival in Washington City in the dead of night, they mocked the president mercilessly, running political cartoons such as this. And when one of the Southern plotters saw Lincoln arrived at that Willard Hotel, he said to Henry Seddon, later the Confederate Secretary of the War, "How the devil did he get through Baltimore?" Now, why is this story important? Because this is the first assassination plot against Lincoln, well organized and thoroughly committed in its mission, and it's strongly suspected that John Wilkes Booth was involved in that plot. And how do we know this? There are many reasons. Booth was a native of Baltimore. He grew up there. He knew the city well, and at the time, Baltimore was his home base. It was also the hub of Confederate espionage. And 4 separate intelligence reports documented that Booth was involved in this first report plot to kill and assassinate Lincoln. One of those reports stated that John Wilkes Booth, third son of Booth, the tragedian actor, raised a company of desperados. He was their ringleader. See, the Booths were a family of actors, kind of like the Baldwins, when you think nowadays, except for the Rust incident, you know. In any event, the father was a famous Shakespearean actor from England. His name was Junius. His older brother was Edwin. He was also a Shakespeare actor. And so 2 more reports streamed in. That one was that it identified the plotter as an actor who recited passages from Julius Caesar in their meetings. That could only have been Booth. Nobody else knew Shakespeare that well. And another report stated the plotters justified their actions because they were acting like Brutus in ridding the country of a Caesar-like tyrant. Booth, as you may know, was a trained Shakespeare actor who could recite Julius Caesar at will and repeatedly compared himself to Brutus, Caesar's assassin. And finally, we strongly suspect that Booth was involved because of an arrest report later that year, down at the bottom, when Pinkerton was authorized to round up disloyal Baltimoreans. Among those, the police report said the police arrested was a John Wilkes. We now turn to the second attempt at Lincoln. It's 1864, the Civil War is raging. Lincoln authorizes a raid on a Confederate prison camp to free thousands of Union troops held in inhumane condition. This prison camp was called Belle Island. It was located south of Richmond, the capital of the Confederacy. Lincoln chose this man, a young Colonel Ulrich Dahlgren, whose picture is here on the left, who was the son of one of his most trusted advisors, his munitions expert, to lead the raid. So he was the son of one of Lincoln's aides. It was a courageous mission, and Dahlgren and his troops, their job was to free the Union soldiers held in captive in prisons down in Belle Island, and they were being treated mercilessly. See the picture on the right-hand side of the boa? That's what they looked like. Hadn't been fed adequately or treated well. So Dahlgren and his men were behind enemy lines, and they ended up getting captured. On Dahlgren's person, there were orders. And the orders said the following: once the prisoners are loose, the men must keep together, and once in the city, it must be destroyed, and Jeff Davis and the cabinet killed. That was a document that Ulrich Dahlgren kept on his person, and it's believed to have come directly from Abraham Lincoln. Now the Confederate cabinet possessed a Union document they believed detailed a plot to kill their own president, Jefferson Davis, president of the Confederacy. And here's the Confederate cabinet. You had Judah Benjamin, we're going to talk about him in a little bit, the Confederate Secretary of State. You had Jefferson Davis, who was the president of the Confederacy, and other similar Southern sympathizers with their mission. When Jefferson Davis and the cabinet saw the letter or the orders, they were incensed. The gloves were off. In retaliation, they developed a series of plots to kidnap or assassinate Lincoln. If you see in the upper right-hand corner, the Secret Service, we have our own Secret Service that protects the President of the United States. Well, the Confederacy had their own Secret Service protecting Jefferson Davis and other leaders of the Confederacy. Their code words were, "Come victory." Come victory, that was the code. After this plot was discovered with Colonel Algren, they changed their code to "Come retribution," showing how they were turning to just vengeance against the North. And they were led by this guy, Judah Benjamin, who was the head of the Confederate Secret Service and also the head of their Secretary of State. Now, up until that point, there had been one mission and one mission only, and that was to subjugate the North, and now they just wanted, that's all they wanted to do. Well, they wanted to win too, but they wanted to go after the North, and they were peeved. They retaliated by a series of terrorist acts in 1864 against the North. Northern cities, including New York, were targeted for burning. Shirts infected with yellow fever were gifted to Lincoln, and they even planned to blow up what we now know to be the White House. In those days, it was called the Executive Mansion, okay? They didn't name it the White House until 1908 by Teddy Roosevelt. The Dahlgren Papers, now there is some scholarly debate as to whether the Dahlgren Papers were real and authentic and genuine. I happen to think that they were, but more importantly, it really doesn't matter whether they were genuine or not, because the Confederacy now had a document that they believed to be genuine, and they could see that Lincoln and his people were going to go after them personally and murder them. During several summers of his presidency, Lincoln actually did not live in the Executive Mansion during the summer. Now, why is that? I'll show you in just a moment. He actually lived at a place called the Anderson Cottage from about mid-May through the end of October. He didn't live there for the first year, but his second, third, and fourth years he lived there. He lived up here, about 2 miles north of the Capitol. And it was on the grounds of what they called the soldiers' home, where soldiers were recuperating from injuries sustained in the battles. And this is the building in which, you see in the upper right-hand corner? That's the building in which Lincoln lived during the summer months. And here's a much better photograph of it. I was just there last Saturday. Yeah. If you get a chance to go to Washington, D.C., please take that in. Not just the Lincoln Memorial, the Jefferson Memorial. Please go to the Anderson Cottage, because I'll tell you why. They have not changed that building almost at all. The floorboards where you walk are the same floorboards that Lincoln walked on. The handrails on the stairs are the same handrails, not changed, that Lincoln held. So when you hold them, you're holding a piece of history. The steps on which you take to go to the second floor are the very same stairs that Lincoln stepped on. It's a remarkable piece of history. Now that cottage, it's a pretty little thing, isn't it? I mean, it's a little different, but it's pretty. It was located on a hill that overlooked the city of Washington. The air was fresh and clean, in contrast to the foul summer odors rising from the steamy Washington City swamps. And Washington City was a swamp. It was all low land, and it stunk in the summer. Just think of all the horses and what horses do and all that, and the mud, and it stunk. That's why Lincoln wanted to leave with his family and go up to that beautiful spot that overlooked it, and the air was fresh. Confederate agents knew he traveled that same route from the Anderson cottage to the executive mansion. He would leave early every morning before his bodyguards woke up, because he just didn't like to have anybody make a big fuss about him. Booth and his co-conspirators planned to lie in wait along the roadway there, capture Lincoln, and take him to Richmond as a hostage. So they lay by the roadside on their bellies for hours, but Lincoln never showed up that morning. He had other plans, and Booth's co-conspirators became disenchanted with the whole scheme and abandoned it. This led to the third and final plot by Booth against Lincoln. And here is the timeline of events that led to his assassination. Booth, believe it or not, travels to Montreal. And you say, what in the world was he doing up in Montreal? Well, that was the center for the Confederate Secret Service outside of the continental United States. That's where they launched a lot of their surreptitious activities. He meets with a Confederate Secret Service agent at this hotel called St. Lawrence Hotel, St. Lawrence Hall in Montreal, where he meets with this fellow, Patrick Martin. Patrick Martin worked for the South. He was a Confederate Secret Service agent, and he was the head of the entire operation. Martin and Booth go to a bank in Montreal at the Ontario Bank, and Martin gives Booth $455 to finance Booth's kidnapping plan. At that point, it was a kidnapping plan. And he also gives him what we call 2 letters of introduction. In other words, he knows somebody else, and he's trying to tell them that this guy, Booth, can be trusted. He's a conspirator just like I am. Not me, but I'm not a conspirator, at least that I know of anyways. And those letters are to be given to the leaders of the Confederate underground in Maryland. Martin accompanies Booth to that Ontario bank, and Booth exchanges the cash for what we would now know to be traveler's checks, or a bill of exchange in sterling. By the way, how do we know this? Because Union soldiers, after Booth died, found that bill of exchange in Booth's very pocket. Booth returns to Washington, where he deposits $500. He has to finance this thing. He deposits $500 into a checking account, see, on the left-hand side, in January. And that's a copy of the actual deposit slip. Dr. Mudd introduces Booth to a Thomas Harbin, and he is a Confederate Secret Service agent, as is John Surratt to his right, who's about as evil a guy as I think I've ever encountered, including people in the courts, believe me. Now, Dr. Mudd, who we talked about earlier, actually introduces Booth to that agent, Thomas Harbin, who later helps Booth escape from Washington City after he kills President Lincoln. And Dr. Mudd, who we talked about earlier, also is introduced to Booth, And he takes Booth to meet a farmer who sells Booth a getaway horse for the night of the Lincoln murder. And Booth Mudd also introduces Booth to this fellow, John Surratt. John Surratt, another Confederate Secret Service agent who worked directly for this man, Judah Benjamin, who was the Confederate Secretary of State and also, coincidentally, the head of the Confederate Secret Service. So John Surratt did all the dirty deeds for Judah Benjamin. Surratt becomes a member of the conspiracy and in turn recruits 3 more individuals into the Booth nest of conspirators. And there they are. Booth, Lewis Powell, AKA Lewis Payne, George Azerrod, Davy Herold, Sam Arnold, Michael O'Laughlin, Ned Spangler, and John Surratt. And who's in the middle? Can anybody tell me her name? Mary Surratt, exactly. Now, they meet frequently at the Surratt Boarding House and Tavern. This is the building around the corner from Ford's Theater where the conspirators hatched their plot. Mary Surratt owned this particular building. So there's Mary Surratt. She actually also owned a building in what we now know to be Clinton, Maryland, but in those days it was called Surrattsville. And this is another place where the conspirators met. Mary Surratt was all over this plot. She owned the 2 buildings. She served them breakfast, lunch, and dinner while they discussed what they were going to do and when they were going to do it. And that Surrattsville is about a half an hour from the city of Washington. Turning to the day of the assassination, and I'd like you to appreciate this. Today is April 17th. It's a Friday. 3 days ago, at 7:22 in the morning, Abraham Lincoln died 160 years ago to that day. 3 days ago at 7:22. So let's go to the morning of that date. Things looked brighter for President Lincoln on that Friday. It was a Good Friday, just like today, folks. It was Good Friday. 5 days earlier, General Robert E. Lee for the Confederacy ended the long nightmare of the Civil War by surrendering his army. So President Lincoln decided that he could enjoy an evening of relaxation and attend a play at Ford's Theater. He had been there many times. He enjoyed it very much. And he'd actually seen Booth perform several times. At about 8:30 that night, the President and Mrs. Lincoln, accompanied by another couple, Major Henry Rathbone and his date Clara Harris, arrived at the theater. The presidential party took their seats in this and by the way, the woman who was the lead actress in that, Laura Keene, was from Massachusetts. That's Ford's Theater there on the left. In any event, this is the presidential box. It's a sketch. It's not accurate. I mean, it's not completely accurate. They tried to, it's not a real photograph of what was happening because they didn't know that was what was going to happen. And this is pretty close to what the presidential box looked like. And as you can see, Booth is here. He's going to shoot the president. He had one shot in his Derringer. The Derringer is a very small pistol, and it went into the lower left portion behind his left ear, and it lodged itself above his right eye. And I'll tell you why that's important in a few moments. During the 3rd act of the play, Wilkes climbed the theater stairs near Lincoln's special box, and he presented his calling card to Lincoln's one guard. There was only one guard. See, no president of the United States had ever been killed before. This was unheard of. So I think that's actually quite a beautiful calling card. People had calling cards, kind of like business cards, but they served both a social and a business purpose. Now remember, Booth was one of the most famous actors in America at the time. It'd be kind of like Tom Hanks showing up, or Brad Pitt saying, can I have a word with the president? I just want to sneak in and say hello. So the guard didn't think anything was wrong. He allowed Booth entry through a lobby door to the presidential box. When he reached the presidential box, he pushed the door open suddenly, and from a distance of just 4 feet, just like here, from behind this fellow, and don't die on me, just about this far, he shot him. He had obviously a good vantage point. The president had no idea what was going on. Major Rathbone, by the way, that is the original door to the presidential box. Major Rathbone sprang up to grab the assassin, slashed him with a large knife. Rathbone grabbed Booth's clothing, and matter of fact, the crowd thought that this was part of the play. It was like, they thought it was like, oh, this is kind of funny, huh? Look at that, the guy is jumping around. So he jumps from the booth, or the box, I should say, not the booth. Booth doesn't jump from the booth, he jumps from the box. And he gets his foot caught, he gets his stirrup caught in the American flag that's there. And then he falls awkwardly 12 feet to the stage and breaks his fibula. Now you see in the upper left-hand corner, that's an x-ray. They didn't have x-rays until the 1920s, but that was that's an x-ray of a fractured fibula. It's very painful. He jumps onto the stage and he shouts, "Sic semper tyrannis," which is Latin for "thus always to tyrants," which is the motto of the Commonwealth of Virginia. He mounts a horse, sweeps rapidly down an alley, and disappears into the darkness. Simultaneously to Booth's fatal shot, there were actually three other assassination plots unfolding. See, they were going to try to cut out the entire head of the American, or the Northern, of the Union leadership. About all this was set to happen at 10:15. A fellow by the name of Lewis Powell, at the same time that Booth fired his fatal shot, he and Davy Herold arrive at the home of Secretary of State Seward. Do you ever hear of Seward's folly? Okay, well he was a New York governor who became Secretary of State under Lincoln and one of his closer advisors. Now, Seward at this time is bedridden. He had been in a terrible carriage accident the week before and was really in tough shape. He was sleeping, he was under sedatives and so forth. But Powell reaches the front of that door, the killer, and pushes his way past a servant at the front door, only to be confronted by Seward's son. And he tells the son that he has a bag of prescription medication from the doctor that he must give to Seward personally. No one else. The son says, "I'll take it up to him. He's resting. Leave it alone." The guy says, "No, I'm going to take it up. I have to take it up and see him." Okay. The Seward's son said, repeatedly, "No, you're not going upstairs. You're not," barred his way. Booth took out his gun. Not Booth, but Powell took out his gun and from a distance of about 3 or 4 feet shoots the guy. And normally you'd be dead, but the gun misfired. The gun misfired, and he didn't shoot him. Instead, unfortunately, he took the butt of that revolver and repeatedly bashed Seward's son over the head with his brains leaking out. Okay? He was in a coma for several months. Now, what happened was Seward's daughter was sitting by the bedside. The bedroom was completely dark. It was pitch black. But when she heard the commotion outside the door, she opened it to find out what was going on, and light streamed in. Powell finished with Seward's son. He sees the bed and he immediately jumps on the bed and tries to stab Seward over and over and over again to try to cut the jugular vein. The problem was Seward's neck had been, he had fractured so many bones in his face from the horse carriage accident, that it was all wired, and the knife couldn't go through all the wiring that was there. So even though he was severely injured, he wasn't killed. It was almost a miracle. Then Powell fights with both a male nurse and Seward's daughter, who's trying to help out. And Seward ends up looking like this. The photo on the right is him as a vigorous politician. The one on the right is a better photo of what he was recovering from. He was permanently disfigured on the left-hand side of his face. On the way outside of the Seward home, Powell fights with Seward's other son and a State Department courier, and he slashes the throat of the courier. But once on the street, he found himself alone. His friend, Davy Harold, heard the struggle and ran away. And we now turn to the assassination attempt against Vice President Johnson. A fellow by the name of George Azarat was armed with a gun. He checked into the Kirkwood Hotel, this hotel. Vice President Johnson was staying there, and just before he was supposed to assassinate Vice President Johnson, George Azarat began drinking heavily in the hotel bar. He quickly became drunk, unable to murder Vice President Johnson. He wandered the streets of the Capitol for the rest of the night. So that plot doesn't work out because George Azarat had a little bit of a, whatever. After the assassination, police searched George Azarat's hotel room, and what do they discover? A loaded revolver, a large Bowie knife, a map of Virginia, and a bank book in the name of John Wilkes Booth. There was yet another plot to kill Secretary of State Stanton, but the Confederate Secret Service agents failed in that attempt. And there was a final plot to kill General Grant, but it fizzled out. See, the word was out on the street that General Grant and his wife were going to attend Ford's Theater that night as guests of the president and his wife. The truth of it is, the gossip is, I can see some smiles. What's the gossip? Julia Grant, General Grant's wife, couldn't stand Mary Todd Lincoln. They just she couldn't stand her. Mary Todd Lincoln was awfully tough to take. A spoiled, rich family from Kentucky. So she said to her husband, we got to get out of this thing. We can't go to this. This is going to be terrible. So they made up the excuse, and they actually did follow it up on it, that they were going to go to New Jersey that night and visit their kids, who they hadn't seen in quite a long time. Don't forget, their father had been the general. Interestingly, as the Grants were, Mr. and Mrs. Grant were leaving town, or the city, they were in a horse-drawn carriage heading out of the city, but who's coming in a horse-drawn carriage on the other side? John Wilkes Booth saw them leaving. Meanwhile, a manhunt is underway to capture Booth. A lot of money, $100,000, $50,000, $50,000, $25,000, $25,000 for the other people. So those were plastered everywhere. And Booth was very clever. He hid out for almost 3 weeks in the countryside of Maryland, accompanied only by Davy Harold, who was the fellow who had been with Lewis Powell. And Union soldiers tracked Booth to the Maryland farmhouse of Dr. Samuel Mudd. Booth had set his broken leg and Mudd had set Booth's broken leg and left. And Mudd, when inquired of by the Union soldiers, denied that he had ever seen Booth, he had ever met Booth. But in truth, Dr. Samuel Mudd and Booth had met 3 separate times before the assassination. The dates of those meetings and what transpired and the location are all detailed in your booklet. Mudd also misled the Union soldiers by telling them that Booth had headed south instead of heading east, as he really did. But when the troops went south they realized that they had been lied to, and they came back to Mudd, and they were angry. They searched his home, And what happens immediately after they start searching the home? Dr. Mudd's wife came out and she says, this is a boot, and his wife produces that boot that belonged to John Wilkes Booth. How do we know? Because the words J. Wilkes is engraved in the boot. And you see how it's cut here? That's where Dr. Mudd had to go in and set the break or the fracture of Booth's lower limb. Booth, as I said, hid in the thicket of the Maryland countryside for over 3 weeks. Finally, he approaches the Garrett family at their farmhouse in Maryland and asks if he can sleep there. Otherwise, they were sleeping out in the woods in the cold, and it was April, so it's really not that warm. The Garretts refused their efforts to sleep in their house and instead tell them that they can sleep in the barn, and then they tip off. The Garretts tip off the Union soldiers. Union soldiers surround the barn. They tell Booth to surrender, and he is shot to death. He refuses to surrender. The other conspirators are all rounded up and charged. By the way, interestingly, the route of the bullet that the Union soldier shot to kill John Wilkes Booth went in the left lower part of his ear and lodged itself above the right eye, just as Abraham Lincoln's bullet did. Now, what do we do legally? We have President Johnson and his cabinet deeply divided. How do we try these people? We've got 9 conspirators or so. Should we use a military tribunal, or should we have a criminal trial, a public forum to try all these conspirators? And these are the reasons for and against a military tribunal. First, against, it's arguably unconstitutional. The rules of conduct can be slanted against the defendants, and you don't need a unanimous verdict. But the reasons for a military tribunal is that the war was really not still over. General Joseph Johnston was down in North Carolina, and he intended to continue that fight, and indeed did continue that fight. Not only after April 3rd, when Robert E. Lee surrendered his sword to General Grant, but he was out in the field fighting the Union forces until May 8th. So the war was still going on. Washington at the time had strong Southern sympathies. So if you were to choose a jury, it could be composed of people who just think killing President Lincoln was just swell. There really were no Union soldiers that were in the city of Washington. They were all out in the field fighting the war. So those are the reasons for and against. And what does President Johnson do? Because he succeeds President Lincoln. He does what most politicians do. He punted. He asked his Attorney General, James Speed, to prepare an opinion on the legality of the trial, whether it be a military tribunal or a civilian criminal trial. In the final analysis, the idea that they be tried before a military tribunal wins out. And these are the soldiers who were served on the military tribunal. You'll notice there's no women on there. There are no women jurors in the country at that time. On May 1st, 1865, Johnson ordered that they be tried before a 9-person military commission. The War Department saw that trial as an opportunity to prosecute not only the charged conspirators, but also Jefferson Davis, the president of the conspiracy, as well as the Confederate Secret Service. Remember, Confederate leaders had plotted to destroy public buildings in the North, poison the New York City water supply, and even mount a biological attack. This is an actual sketch, there are very few that exist, of the defendants in the dock. Prosecutors offered evidence that the conspiracy against Lincoln and other high government officials began sometime in the summer of 1864, as I've outlined earlier. The Confederate Secret Service head was quoted as saying that the goal of the conspiracy was to leave the government entirely without a head by killing not only Lincoln, but also Vice President Johnson, Secretary of War Stanton, Secretary of State Seward, and General Grant. Confederate President Jefferson Davis's guilt was established by a letter discovered in Booth's hotel room. The letter was in code, but when deciphered, Jefferson Davis, the president of the conspiracy, notified Booth that their friends should set to work as he had directed. You generally don't have conspiracies written out in a memorandum and handed to somebody. You tell people and then you say, do what I told you to do, you know? So after Union soldiers captured Richmond, they found this replica. This is a replica. This coding machine in Secretary of State Judah Benjamin's office. And when federal agents seized Booth's personal items from his Washington hotel room, they deciphered coded letters matching the encryption from Judah Benjamin's machine. And here is the code book that John Wilkes Booth used. Now, are there more documents that can lay out this plan? Of course not, because the day that Richmond fell, Judah Benjamin burned most of his correspondence and records. But modern scholarship has been able to determine that the plot to kill President Lincoln had been approved and financed by the highest levels of the Confederate leadership, including Secretary of State Judah Benjamin. Benjamin, the fellow I showed you before, was the brains behind the Confederacy and the most trusted confidant of President Jefferson Davis, the head of the conspiracy. There can be little doubt that given Booth's activities in Montreal, Canada, his receipt of monies from the Confederate Secret Service, and his alliance with John Surratt, remember him? Booth had acted as an agent of the Confederacy. Even Booth's own sister, Asia, described her brother in her memoirs as a spy. And while on the lam, John Surratt admitted to others that over $10,000 of Confederate money, which translates to about $140,000 in today's dollars, was spent on the assassination plot. And finally, the most famous historian who's examined the issue summarized his work as follows. What has been established is that there was a network of documented facts that logically conclude that Davis attacked the leaders of the federal government. And in the end, the military tribunal found all of the defendants guilty. 4 of them, Surratt, Powell, Herold, and Azarat, were sentenced to death by hanging. 3 others received life imprisonment, and the 8th defendant served an 6-year prison sentence. Now, interestingly, this is a photo taken just before the 4 conspirators were executed, and they're going to be hung. This is Mary Surratt right here. Interestingly, the sun was very hot that day, and just before she was going to be hung, the men thought it would be a chivalrous thing to hide her eyes from the sun so she wouldn't be disturbed by it. That's the way the 19th century was. What can I tell you? So there was one co-conspirator who eluded capture for over a year, John Surratt, Jr., who fled to Canada, then England, and then finally to Rome, where he got a job as a guard for the Pope. And so we end the almost incredible story of what Vice President Johnson called the nest that hatched evil, a fully documented, widespread conspiracy to decapitate the Union government in a final, desperate effort by the Confederacy. It was truly a spider's web of evil, filled with venomous, hateful men and one woman. By contrast, when Lincoln breathed his last in his deathbed at 7:22, several days ago in 160 years, his cabinet secretary Stanton said, "Now he belongs to the ages." Thank you very much.